So yesterday I talked about, and if you were with us for the Palm Sunday episode, we talked about two processions entering Jerusalem. One looked like empire, and one looked like something else. And we ended there, and in that image, the crowd cheering, the branches waving, this electric moment of possibility. And I want to pick right back up where we left off, because this is Holy Week, and we're telling the story of Jesus' last week in Jerusalem. And so the very next day, Jesus walks into the temple. He's gone through the parade, but the next day he walks into the temple, and he doesn't just observe what's happening there. He's been there so many times before. He walks in, looks around, and he starts flipping tables. I mean, he's got a whip, right? I've been sitting with that image all week because I think it's one of the most misread moments of our gospel story. We tend to treat it as the one time Jesus lost his temper. The one moment where the gentle, patient, turn the other cheek Jesus just snapped, right? But what if that's completely wrong? What if Jesus isn't losing control, but Jesus is being the most precise and intentional he's ever been? I'm your host, Pastor Andrew Shipley, and we are continuing our series, Unlearning Empire, a podcast from Missiongathering. This is the episode where Jesus flips the tables. Let's get into it. Okay, so I need to give you some context here, because if you grew up in the church, you probably have a very specific image of the temple. Quiet, sacred, reverent, maybe a little like the church building you grew up in. Hushed voices, stained glass, everyone in their best dressed attire and in their best behavior. But the actual second temple in Jerusalem was nothing like that. It was enormous. It was loud. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, an economic hub. And here's how it worked. To participate in Passover, Jewish worshipers were required to offer sacrifice, animals, doves, lambs, depending on what you could afford. But you couldn't just bring your own animal from home. The priests had the authority to declare your animal unacceptable, too many blemishes, the wrong kind, whatever. So you had to buy one at the temple from the approved vendors at the approved prices. And you couldn't use regular Roman currency to buy temple goods because Roman coins had Caesar's image on them, and that was considered idolatrous and to Jewish sacred practices at the time. And so you had to exchange your Roman money for some special temple currency at the money changers' booths, who would charge a fee for the exchange. Are you beginning to see the system here? You come to worship God, you want to participate in your community's most sacred ritual, one of your most sacred rituals. And at every step of the way, there's a toll. The historian Dominic Crossan called the temple system one of the most efficient extraction machines of the ancient world. It looked like religion. It sounded like religion. It smelled like incense and sacrifice, but underneath it was a way for a small group of religious elites who made their peace with Roman occupation in exchange for power to extract money from ordinary people who were just trying to participate in their faith. And the people who get hit the hardest are the people who always get hit the hardest. It's the poor. Wealthy pilgrims could absorb the fees. People who had traveled days on foot to get there, who had saved up for months to afford the trip, who were already living under the weight of Roman taxation. For them, the temple system wasn't just inconvenient, it was another mechanism of extraction on top of an already crushing load. So that's the scene Jesus walks into, not the quiet church you grew up in, but in a machine that was grinding up the poor and extracting everything it could from them. This is not a place that's slightly lost its way. It's a system operating exactly as designed, just not in the direction that anyone would call holy. And Jesus, he doesn't write a letter to the religious authorities. He doesn't request a meeting. He doesn't file a complaint. He walks in, looks at all of it, and starts flipping tables. Actually, he walks in, starts braiding this whip, and starts flipping tables. Coins scatter across the floor. Doves fly out of overturned cages. The whole operation grinds to a halt, and he quotes Isaiah and Jeremiah simultaneously, which, if you know anything about the Hebrew prophets and how they work, it's a very deliberate move. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves. For all nations. That phrase right there is doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting, because the money changers and the animal sellers, they could set up shop in the court of the Gentiles, the one section of the temple that was supposed to be accessible to non-Jewish worshipers. The one space that specifically existed for people on the outside to come and encounter the God of Israel. And they've been turned into a marketplace. So the people who were already on the margin, the foreigners, the outsiders, the people that didn't fully belong, they couldn't even get to the place designated for them without fighting through a commercial operation. The system had consumed the space meant for the excluded to become included. And you just sit with that for a second. Because that pattern, the space for the marginalized getting colonized by the system, that's not an ancient problem. That happens in churches right now all the time. The language of welcome gets used while the actual structures quietly exclude people. The statement on the website says everyone is affirmed, but the leadership doesn't reflect that. The small groups are technically open to everyone, but the culture makes it clear as day who's actually comfortable there. The space designated for people who don't fully belong gets filled up with the machinery of the institution. And that is where Jesus flips the tables. Now, I want to name something about the way this moment usually gets preached. Because there's a version of this story that gets used to justify a lot of things that have nothing to do with what Jesus was actually doing. The Jesus flip tables energy gets weaponized to baptize anger that has nothing to do with justice. Pastors who are just mean and call it prophetic, people who are rude online and call it righteous indignation, institutions that are protecting their own power and framing their aggression as zeal for God's house. And I want to be really clear, crystal clear. That's not what is happening here. Jesus isn't having a bad day. He isn't taking out frustration on bystanders. He isn't performing anger for the crowd so that his likes go up. He's doing something very targeted, very specific, at a system that is exploiting vulnerable people under the cover of sacred language. The disruption is precise. The disruption is on behalf of the people being excluded. The disruption is for something, not just against something. And that distinction, friend, matters enormously. Because a lot of what gets called prophetic disruption is actually just disruption that serves the person doing the disrupting. Real prophetic action costs the person doing it something, and it benefits the people who have been losing. Jesus flips the tables on Monday And if you know the story, by Friday afternoon, he's dead. That's not the arc of someone who is posturing. That's not the arc of someone who is being performative. Okay, so I want to go somewhere with that may be a little uncomfortable, right? Because the temple story isn't just about ancient religious corruption, it's about something empire is really good at. It's good at getting inside the things we consider sacred and using them as cover. Because empire doesn't always look like soldiers and flags. Sometimes empire looks like a financial system that everyone accepts as natural. Sometimes empire looks like a political party that claims God's endorsement while being run by pedophiles. Sometimes empire looks like a church that has so completely absorbed the values of the surrounding culture that it can no longer tell the difference between what God wants and what makes the institution comfortable and financially stable. The late Walter Brueggemann, who we mentioned last episode, talks about how the prophets of Israel were constantly fighting against what he calls the royal consciousness. And the royal consciousness is the mindset that says the way things are is the way things are supposed to be. God bless the current arrangement. Don't disrupt the order. That's ingratitude. That's chaos. That's sin. And the prophets kept saying, they kept showing up, no matter how many of them got killed. No, the way things are is not the way that things are supposed to be. God is not blessing this. What you are calling order is actually organized violence against the poor, and they got killed for it over and over again consistently because the royal conscience does not go quietly. Now, here's what I want to bring closer to home. A lot of us who are in deconstruction space, in the deconstruction space, who are in the reconstruction space, who have stepped back from church and who have been asking the hard questions, we've tended to frame this as, I figured it out, right? I figured it out. The church was corrupted by empire. I got out. Now I'm free, right? That's what I figured out. Church was bad, got corrupted by empire. I got out. Now I'm free. And I understand that. I felt that, right? But here's the harder thing that Jesus is pointing at in this story. It's not just the institutions. It's us. Because the temple system worked not just because the elites ran it, but because ordinary worshipers participated in it. They brought their money, they made the exchanges, they bought the approved animals, they played by the rules. Because that's what you do when you want to access something important. You learn the system, you pay the tolls, you figure out how to get what you need. And we do the same thing. We learn which churches are safe to be queer in. We learn which communities we can bring our full self to. We learn which topics are allowed and which ones will get quietly pushed out. And then sometimes without noticing, we start protecting those communities in ways that recreate the same dynamic that we escaped from. We start having our own unspoken rules about who's really welcome, our own hierarchies of who's sufficiently progressive, our own purity tests dressed up in the language of justice. I'm not saying this to be cynical. I'm saying this because I think it's one of the most honest things the flipping table stories ask us. Where have you learned to survive inside of the system is the question. Where have you learned to survive inside of the system in ways that cost other people something? If you ask yourself that question honestly, that's not a comfortable question. But on Holy Monday, I think it's the right one to ask. And here's the thing that I think I think this is genuinely important, right? That it doesn't get enough space. It never gets said enough in progressive Christian spaces. And, you know, tell me in the comments if you hate this. But not every system needs to be reformed. Some systems need to be interrupted. We have a tendency, especially those of us who grew up in being told that good Christians work within the system, to default to reform language. Let's fix the pipeline. Let's diversify the leadership. Let's update the language. Let's add a new program. And sometimes that is the right move. Sometimes reform is real and meaningful and worth fighting for. But sometimes, even when we don't like it, the system is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. And what it's designed to do is the actual problem. Jesus doesn't walk into the temple and say, I have some suggestions for how to run this more equitably. He flips the tables. He cracks the whip. Because the problem isn't bad management. The problem is the system itself. The way to access God has been monetized. The way the space for the excluded has been consumed. The way the religious language has been legitimized in use of extraction of wealth from the poor. Friends, I know it's hard, but you cannot fix that by tweaking the exchange rate. I think this is one of the places where deconstruction actually has something really important to offer. Because this deconstructing generation has been remarkably good at saying this isn't a management problem. This is a design problem. The question that comes next is harder. What are you building instead? Because disruption without reconstruction just leaves you with scattered coins on the floor. Jesus clears the space, and then immediately the text tells us the blind and the lame come to him in the temple. The people who were never allowed in to begin with, and he heals them. The disruption isn't the end of the story. It's clearing the space for something else, something truer, something that was supposed to be there, but got crowded out by the system again and again and again. And friend, what does that look like for us? What does that look like for you? I want to spend a few minutes here just being honest about where I see the tables in my community, in my current moment. Because this isn't an abstract theological exercise. The temple was a real place. Real money changed hands. Real people were excluded. Real people were exploited. And the equivalent systems are just as real today. Healthcare that functions as a toll system where access to your body's well-being depends on your ability to pay, where people make impossible choices between their rent and their insulin, where people with the least pay the highest price for the worst care. That's a table that needs to be flipped. A criminal justice system where wealth determines your outcome, where two people can commit the same offense and one walks out of the lawyer's office and the other one walks into a cell, not just based on wealth, but based on race. That's a table that needs to be flipped. And churches, I say this as someone who loves the church, who's devoted their life to the church, but churches that take in LGBTQ plus tithes and use that money to fund theology that says those same people aren't fully human. That's a table to be flipped. Educational systems that funnel resources to kids who already have the most and tell kids who have the least that their failure is a personal and moral failing rather than a structural design to make them fail. That's a table that needs to be flipped. And the question Jesus is asking in the temple on Monday, that Monday morning in Holy Week, is what are you going to do about it? Not do you feel bad about it? Not do you have the right opinions about it. You've read the right theories about it. Not have you posted about it. Jesus is asking you right now, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to close this section by naming something that I think is really specific to where a lot of us are right now. A lot of us grew up in systems that taught us that disruption is dangerous and that the most spiritual thing you can do is to maintain the peace, not rock the boat, submit to the authority, work within the channels provided to cause systemic change slowly. And then we watched as the channels led nowhere. Or worse, we watched them get used against the people they were supposed to serve. And we got angry. And that anger turned to exhaustion. And then a lot of us got quiet. Because here's the secret: anger without community is just burnout waiting to happen. And I think that's where communities like my community, Missiongathering, had something to offer, something real to offer, not answers, not perfect systems. We don't have it all figured out. But a community that is committed to staying in the question together, that believes disruption is sometimes holy, that believes the clearing of space is sometimes sacred work, that believes that people who were never allowed in are exactly the people who should be at the center, that is trying stubbornly, imperfectly, consistently to be the kind of church Jesus was pointing to when he cleared the temple court and then welcomed the people who've been standing outside it. So here's where I want to land. If you're in a space right now where you're angry at the church, good. Stay with that. Don't let anyone talk you out of it too quickly. That anger is probably tracking something real. But I invite you to let that anger be generative rather than just destructive. Because Jesus doesn't just flip the tables and walk away. He stays, he teaches, he heals, he keeps showing up. And the question for us is the same one it's always been. What are you building in the space you've cleared? For us at Missiongathering, we're trying to build something specific, a community where the people who were excluded from the court don't just get access, right? They get to shape the culture. Where deconstruction isn't the end of the road, but a doorway into something more honest and more alive. Where justice isn't just a statement on the website, but it's a practice that costs us something. Where table flipping energy of Holy Monday gets followed by the healing and teaching, and eventually by Sunday and the resurrection. That sounds like something you want to be a part of. Come find us. Come skeptical. Come mid-progress. Come so angry you don't know what to do. We've got space for all of that. Because, friend, I'm telling you right now, we're not trying to manage your deconstruction. We're trying to walk through it with you towards something real on the other side as you walk with us. So thanks for being here this Holy Monday. If this resonated with you, this is something you felt, share it. Not as a recruitment pitch, but just as I found this worth my time, and maybe you'll find it worth your time too. Maybe these are some of the answers you've been looking for, friend. Tomorrow in the series, we'll look at something that appears alive but isn't. One of the weirdest stories, the cursed fig tree, which sounds obscure, but turns out to be one of the most honest things Jesus ever said about the difference between performing faith and actually having it. That one's going to sting a little, but I think it's going to sting a little in the best way. Links to Missiongathering and everything else are in the show notes. We will see you tomorrow for Fig Tuesday.